Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Devil's Dentures. That's right, finally a Halloween treat that's actually scary. I mean, no offense, but sticking little pretzels in a mini peanut butter cup and calling it a spooky spider? I mean, was that really supposed to scare us? The only people that's scaring is dentists and dietitians. So here we go, we're gonna need some apples, and I'm gonna use these Red Delicious. This variety has the color that most closely resembles blood gushing from somebody's neck. And we're gonna take that apple and we're gonna cut it in quarters. Now, if you want to get extra fancy, I guess you could take like a melon baller and sort of scoop out that center core part. But you know what? I didn't. That doesn't bother me. Besides, you think Satan's gonna trim out the core? Hell no. And then we're going to take one of the quarters and we're going to put our paring knife in about, half inch from the edge and go down, but not all the way. Stop about a half inch from the bottom. And then you're going to turn it and you're going to cut straight down the other side exactly the same way. And when those two cuts meet, you'll be able to pull that section right out. And then after we make those cuts, we're going to go ahead and give it a quick dip and a little bit of water that has some lemon juice or vinegar in it, just so these don't get brown too fast. So I'm going to give mine a quick dip. So the base of our Devil's Dentures is done, and it's on to the teeth. And for that, we're going to use slivered almonds, which are just the absolute perfect shape for this. And we're going to go ahead and implant them into our apples. But before we do, we're going to make little holes with the tip of our knife. Just go along the gum line. All right, the closer you get to the outside, the better it looks. But if you go too close, it might crack. So just like that should be fine. And after you make your holes, just go ahead and start pushing in teeth. And the beauty of this, it doesn't matter what size, what shape, if it's pointed, if it's flat, if it looks broken, they all look awesome once they're in. It's the variety in lengths and textures that really gives this its spooky look. So we're going to push those in, we're going to flip it over, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And of course, these holes you're making in between the other teeth to give it that sort of offset look. And by the way, do not worry if your friends call these stupid and make fun of them. They're only doing that to cover up their profound terror, all right? Oh, by the way, see that little piece of almond skin that's stuck to the edge there? That's known as the plaque of darkness. Which reminds me, kids, you gotta floss. Make sure you're flossing regularly. And once those are done, we're just gonna place those on a serving platter. And if you think one is scary, when you get a whole collection, oh my God. We're talking about the potential for reoccurring nightmares. And now if you want, you could serve these just like that. But I like to do one extra optional step, which is to drizzle it with some slightly thinned out honey. You know, a little devil's drool. Or as the Spanish inquisitors called it, El Drulo del Diablo. It's going to give those teeth and or fangs a nice, wet, glistening look. And I'm not sure how much scarier it's going to make it look, but it will make it a little sweeter. And once we've drizzled that over, our Devil's Dentures are done. Look at that. I haven't seen teeth that terrifying since my last trip to London. Yes, that's how scary these are. Oh, and one last thing, if you use a pretty sharp knife and dip them in that water, these really don't get brown for a long time. This photo was probably taken 45 minutes after these were made, and they still look really good. And then, of course, you're going to want to bite these before they bite you. And in addition to being so frightening, these actually taste pretty good. Apples, almonds, and honey. What's not going to be good about that, okay? So like I said, Halloween treats are usually not that scary, but in this case, I think you'll agree, truly, truly horrifying. So I really do hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info, as usual. And as always, enjoy meringue bones and ghosts. That's right, not only are these little sweet treats easy to make, they're also incredibly scary. Mostly because of the sugar content, but even still, these simple confections would be perfect for your Halloween theme party. And speaking of scary, a lot of people are very intimidated working with meringues, which is kind of silly, because as I'm about to show you, it's actually very, very simple. So let's go ahead and get started, and for that we're going to need a couple egg whites, and of course you're going to need one of these balloon-style whisks, and of course we're going to use that to beat these egg whites up, but before we do, we're supposed to add a little pinch of cream of tartar. But I'm not going to, because who the heck has cream of tartar? Instead, I'm going to just put a couple drips of lemon juice, because they say a little bit of acid will help stabilize the egg whites. And I would love to fully explain what that means, but I'm not really sure. For more info, you could Google or you could check out some old Alton Brown reruns. But anyway, we're going to take our whisk and we're going to start beating. And this is going to be a very simple, easy process. We're simply going to whisk these up, adding sugar as we go, until we have some beautiful, shiny, pipeable peaks. And we don't want to start mixing in the sugar too early here, okay? So we want to keep whisking and whisking until we have something that looks like this. And I'm not sure what the actual pastry chef term for this is, but I refer to it as the beer head stage. That's the point at which we can start adding our sugar little by little. So basically this is just add some sugar, whisk for half a minute, add a little more, whisk it in, add a little more, until all your sugar has been introduced. And by the way, I mentioned this is a very easy, simple technique, which is true if you use an electric mixer. If you do this by hand like I did, it actually takes a long time. But you know what? I had someone watching me, and I wanted to impress them by how fast I could do this by hand. But of course, instead of commenting on how strong I was, all they could talk about was how much I was sweating. But anyway, the point is, if you have a mixer, use it. And that's mostly because when you add sugar to egg whites, it just takes a lot more time and effort to get the peaks you're looking for. But anyway, we're going to keep whisking and whisking until we have something that looks like this. A beautiful shiny meringue that will hold a shape. All right, so you can see how that stuff is kind of piling up when it falls off the whisk and holds those nice sharp lines. That's exactly what we're looking for. And at that point, we're going to transfer this into a piping bag and make whatever shape you want. Today we're doing bones and mini ghosts. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the bones. And it had been quite a few years since I did this, so I was experimenting with different techniques. For this first one, I did the bone first, and then I added the joints on either end. So that worked okay, but for the second one, I decided to go with the joints first, and then make the bone, and then finish the joints on the other end. And the beauty of a project like this is don't worry too much about what it looks like now. When these are done and all piled up on a plate, they're going to look awesome. No one's going to say, hey, which exact bone is that? If you got a few bumps here and there, or a few points here and there, it's fine. You could just tell people those are demonic bone spurs, or the first signs of osteoporosis, or in this case, ghosteoporosis. Oh yeah, even the puns are terrifying. But anyway, I'm going to pipe out a pan of bones, and we'll set those aside while we use the rest of the meringue to make little ghosts, which are even easier than the bones because all you're going to do is pipe up a little swirl of meringue like this. And when those are cooked, they're going to look exactly like small ghosts, or at least what cartoonists in the early part of last century thought ghosts looked like. And as you can see, I'm using some extremely frightening backlighting. And speaking of shadows, if you're my age, do you remember that show Dark Shadows? Man, that was a creepy show. That show caused a lot of nightmares growing up, almost as many as Captain Kangaroo. But anyway, we're going to do a pan of ghosts, and at that point, we're going to transfer our meringue treats into a preheated 225-degree oven for about an hour until the meringue is cooked firm and pretty much dry to the touch. But you're not done. Don't take them out of the oven yet. Turn off the oven, close the door, and let them sit for another hour in the oven cooling. Okay, this way the meringue's going to get nice and dried out. It's going to stay nice and crispy. So I let mine cool down in the turned off oven for an hour, at which point we're ready to enjoy. So first things first, let me show you how to not take these off the pan. Because you might be thinking, hey, I can just pull these right off the pan. There's not going to be a problem. Let me just grab it, pull it up. I'm sure it will come up in one piece. And no, it broke. Did not see that coming. So don't do it that way. What you want to do is put your hand under the liner, under the sill pad or the parchment paper, and these things will pop right off. Now, of course, having said that, if you do break a couple, don't worry. It'll just make your finished presentation look that much more frightening. And at that point, they're ready to transfer onto some kind of plate or platter to be placed in front of your friends at your Halloween party so they can simulate eating the bones of a small mammal. I mean, come on, who's not going to enjoy that? So let me go in for a little taste. And unlike some of the things we make, there's no complexity here. This is just sweet and crunchy. I mean, really, these are mostly air, so they're very light, but very delicious. And you know who would love these? Ghost dogs. But anyway, that's how you do the bones. And then for the ghosts, we could just serve these as is, but what I really like to do is take some melted chocolate and just use the end of a bamboo skewer to make a couple eyes on these things. That's going to make them look much more ghost-like. I mean, without the eyes, these do kind of look like something the ghost dog would leave behind. So I do recommend a couple dots of chocolate. But anyway, that's it. As you saw, a very simple, very easy recipe, and I think a lot of fun to make. In fact, this would be perfect to get the kids involved, especially if you don't have an electric mixer and you don't want to get stuck whisking those egg whites. Have the kids do it. It's good for them. It'll build character. But anyway, I really do hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy face pie. That's right, if you're going to make a meat pie out of someone, the least you could do would be decorate the top with their face as a tribute. And that's exactly what I did here, with the free-range drifter I harvested a few weeks ago. And of course, I'm kidding. There were no actual humans used in the making of this face pie. Allegedly. But anyway, I've probably already said too much. So let's just go ahead and get started with this horrific Halloween recipe. And to get started, what you're going to need is one batch of pastry crust. And that is straight from our tortilla recipe, which I will provide a link for. And what I did first was trace a circle around my pie dish, so I would have a little bit of an outline to help me design my face. And once that was set, I started cutting off pieces of dough, so I could start building the underlying structure of the facial features. And I started with that bony part above the eyes, which I believe is called the eyebrowial ridge. Oh, and by the way, fair warning, in many parts during this I have to speed up the video, since I took way too long shaping this. But anyway, after my eyebrow bones were done, I started on the nose bone, which I believe is technically cartilage. And once I had the general shape of the nose done, I went ahead and formed the lips, which as you probably know are neither bone nor cartilage, just some good old-fashioned muscle tissue. And before I knew it, my face started to take shape. And from there I continued on with what I thought were going to be cheekbones, but I kind of put them too high, since believe it or not, this is my first face pie. So live and learn. And after what were supposed to be the cheekbones, I went ahead and added some eye lumps. And the reason I really wasn't that concerned at this point, with these pieces being too precise, is because after shaping these underlying features, my plan was to place a very thin skin of pie dough over the top. And then I'd use that to mold the final face. So that was my game plan. And after getting it to this point, I slid it on a sheet pan so I could pop that in the freezer so that those pieces of dough would be nice and hard when I laid over my skin. So I popped the pan in the freezer and the dough back in the fridge to firm it up a little bit. And once that dough had re-chilled a little bit, I pulled it out and took half of it and formed it into a disc. And with the help of some flour and a rolling pin, I went ahead and rolled that out to a round shape fairly thin, maybe about 1/8 of an inch. And once that was set, I went ahead and pulled out my frozen face parts. And I centered my edible epidermis over the top. And then very carefully I used my fingertips to kind of push it and pull it into place. And because the dough underneath had been in the freezer and was nice and firm, and this dough I had just rolled was nice and soft and flexible, it was actually pretty easy to shape into what you're seeing here. And I think it was right about here that I realized my nose and lips were probably a little too big, but I was too far in at this point to change that. Plus, I didn't really care that much because this is a Halloween thing. And no matter how it came out, I was just going to say that's how it was supposed to look. And as far as smoothing and smearing the dough in certain spots, I found that dipping my fingers in some water really helped. And as with any time we're working with pastry dough, whenever it seems like it's getting too warm and too soft to work with, we'll just go ahead and pop it in the fridge for a few minutes so that butter firms back up. So that's what I did here. And then I went ahead and pulled it back out. And then using a chopstick, I made some nostrils, because my pinky was too big, and I didn't think a pencil would be sanitary. And then after creating some beautiful nasal passages, I moved on to work on the eyes. And my plan was to have one of them open and one of them closed. So for the open one, I cut some dough out of the center. And then for the closed one, I just cut a slit in the center. And then made a second cut right underneath, because I think that's what an eyelid looks like. I also took the knife and cut a little bit between the lips, because I was hoping as this baked some of the juices would bubble up through, which they never did. But anyway, once I was happy with how my face was looking, I decided I needed to pop that into the freezer so it would be nice and stiff and firm, so I'd be able to pull off that paper and then lay that over my filling. So I went ahead and transferred that into the freezer for about 15 minutes, which gave me plenty of time to roll out the rest of the dough to form the bottom crust. And once that was accomplished, I went ahead and started spooning in fill. Sorry, not spooning in fill. Spooning in the filling. Which, by the way, just like the crust, is from our famous tortillere video. One of the most delicious things you'll ever eat. So even if you're not going to make a face, you should definitely try that recipe. And once I had that all transferred in, I went ahead and pulled out my now firm face from the freezer and pulled off the paper and placed that on top. And then I had to wait about 10 or 15 minutes for this to thaw a little bit before I could do the final shaping. And while I was waiting, I went ahead and made an egg wash, which we're going to use to paint over the top. And also, as you'll see, to add some coloring. So I went ahead and beat 1 large egg with a tablespoon of water. And we'll set that aside until needed. And in about 10 or 15 minutes later, that dough is flexible enough to do the final shaping. And as you can see, I'm kind of tucking it in a little bit around the edges, because I was afraid if I stretched it too much, as it baked, it might lose some of the detail. Plus, I wanted to maintain kind of a roundish shape and not have this too flat. And then once I was happy with that, I went ahead and took a knife and cut off the excess, trimming all the way around underneath the edge of the dish. And then after parting those lips a little more, I moved on to adding an eyeball, for which I used a half a grape. And then I cut and placed a couple pieces of dough over that to form what I hoped would look like eyelids. And by using a grape, I thought as it baked, some of those sugary juices would leak out and kind of caramelize in a gross, disgusting way. But unfortunately, they never did. So I probably should have used a cherry tomato or an actual regular cherry. But anyway, if you make this, that'll be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the Bill Nye of what to use for your face pie eye. And then once that was set, I moved back to the lips and went around cutting some very shallow lines to make my probably way too large lips look a little more realistic. And then once I finished that, I moved on to some fine-tuning for like way too many minutes. And by the way, in hindsight, all these final tweaks were totally unnecessary, since most of the details kind of baked out as this cooked, including trying to add some wrinkles to the bridge of the nose and around the eyes. And then, many minutes later, when I was finally satisfied, I went ahead and grabbed the egg wash. And I applied this 3 different times. Okay, the first time was just to brush plain egg wash over the whole thing. And then I added 1 very small drop of red food coloring to make sort of a pink mixture that I used to kind of color the flesh around the eyes and the nose. And then finally, for the third application, I added 1 big drop of red food coloring and used that to color the lips and the tip of the nose. And I kind of thought as this baked that would turn into more of a blood red look, but it didn't. It pretty much kept that color. And once baked looked like really cheap lipstick and looked like nothing Phil would have worn in real life. But anyway, I went ahead and colorized that face the best I could, at which point I grabbed a fork so I could crimp the edge, which, by the way, is very hard to do if the dough is warmed up and is very soft like this. So I probably should have popped this back in the fridge for a few minutes, or done it earlier. But anyway, I pressed on, and it worked. And that's it, my face pie was finally ready for the oven. Oh, and by the way, if you're doing this for a party, make sure everybody gets their pictures right here, since it was at this point the most creepy and horrible and disturbing looking. So get your pictures before you pop it in the oven. And when you are finally ready to bake, we're going to go ahead and put that on a baking sheet in case it drips. And I also decided to very loosely tent some foil over the top. Okay, I didn't want my facial features browning too much, although I did pull that off halfway through the baking. But anyway, I popped that into the center of a 375-degree oven for just over an hour, or until it looked like this. Oh yeah, check it out. It's a meat pie with a face. And even though we did lose a lot of detail during the baking process, it still, I thought, came out looking very disturbing, which, if everything goes according to plan, will give our guests nightmares for many months to come. So I was very happy and frightened with how good this came out. And I went ahead and transferred that onto a rack so it would cool a little faster, because I was rapidly losing daylight, and I wanted to be able to take some decent shots of me cutting a slice. So I let that cool down a little, and I went ahead and took a wedge out of the cheek, since that's my favorite part of the face. And even though this was still a little too hot, it came out pretty nicely. And no, in case you're wondering, that weird orange-looking thing is not part of the thyroid gland. See, that's what I thought. But it was actually just a little piece of golden brown crust that got soaked with the meat juices. And I ended up plucking it out because it did look kind of weird in the pictures. And then, just to make it an official Food Wishes video, I went in for a taste. And again, if you have not tried our Montreal meat pie, also known as tourtière, do yourself a favor and check it out. It is so delicious. Those French Canadians know how to eat. But anyway, that's it. How to make a meat pie with a face. Whether you make this with an actual free-range drifter, or simply by using some pork and beef like I did, allegedly. Either way, I think this would make a stunning centerpiece to your Halloween-themed party. I mean, that, my friends, is going to be memorable. In fact, maybe too memorable. But having said that, I still really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with maybe my scariest, most terrifying video recipe ever. Severed fingers. That's right, we're going to make severed cheese fingers. Take your basic string cheese, mozzarella cheese stick, and what we're going to do is take a paring knife and just kind of round off the two ends. Basically, you want it to look like fingertips. So just go around. Because these are basically severed corpse fingers, you don't need them perfect. Then we are going to tear it in half to simulate a ripped off finger. We need tendons, we need ligaments, we need grossness. So pull it apart, very irregular. Then I'm going to take a paring knife and just make a little nail bed on the end. Stick on a piece of slivered almond, and then use a knife to make some knuckle marks, and you have a finger. Look how white it is. That's because all the blood is drained. All right, when all your fingertips are ready, you can put some ketchup or hot sauce on a plate, dip the severed, torn off, irregular end in, and there you go. Oh my God, that's so scary. I actually scared myself making this. This will make a disgustingly beautiful appetizer for your Halloween party. And look, see how that hot sauce kind of sticks into the string cheese and it looks just like a torn off finger. Really, really cool effect. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Give it a try. Go to the site. There's no recipe there. But you know what? There's other stuff there. So check out the site. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with zombie meatloaf. That's right, do not let the gruesome appearance fool you. Beneath that horrifying complexion, we have what turned out to be a really, really nice meatloaf. So even if you're not trying to scare and or gross out your guests at your Halloween party, you'll still hopefully find this video worthwhile. Although I should mention quickly that if you make this without the zombie face, I will haunt your dreams. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our meatloaf mix. And to begin that, we will melt a scary amount of butter over medium-high heat in a skillet, to which we will add a whole bunch of diced celery and onions, as well as some very finely chopped mushrooms, along with a traditional giant pinch of salt. And then what we'll do is stir all that together, and we're going to want to cook this until our onions soften and the mixture starts to turn a little bit golden, which is not going to happen right away, because that salt's going to draw out a lot of water from the mushrooms, and at first your mixture is going to be very wet. But just give it a few minutes and you'll see that water will evaporate, and eventually the mixture will dry out and saute up nicely. And we'll cook that until it looks a little something like this. And once it reaches this stage, what we'll do is turn off the heat and add the following ingredients. We will toss in some finely minced garlic, as well as a healthy dose of freshly ground black pepper. I'm also going to toss in a nice pinch of dried thyme. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of ground ground cayenne. And what we'll do with our heat off is go ahead and stir that in, since there is going to be enough residual heat to take the raw edge off that garlic. And that's it. Once all that's incorporated, we'll simply let that cool down to room temperature before adding it to our meat. Speaking of which, cue the meat. In this bowl I have 3 pounds of ground beef. And in case you're keeping score at home, that is the 85% lean variety. And what we'll need to do is season that up with some kosher salt, which always looks like too much, but it's not. It's the perfect amount. We will also add a splash of milk or buttermilk. I'm using buttermilk because of the pie. Let's also toss in 1 beaten egg, as well as a nice splash of Worcestershire sauce, which, by the way, I'm getting pretty good at pronouncing. But anyway, let's go ahead and finish this up with some ketchup, as well as a generous sprinkling of dry breadcrumb. And that is going to be it for our monstrous meatloaf mix. All we need to do now is add our now cooled vegetable mixture. And once we have everything together, we're going to want to combine this thoroughly using probably our hands, which really does the best job for something like this. And yes, for a zombie meatloaf, it does help if your hands and arms look like a werewolf. But even smooth, hairless ones will work. And we'll go ahead and mix that until it's thoroughly combined, but no further. Okay, once we think it's mixed, we'll stop. At which point we will cover that in plastic and pop it in the fridge until we're ready to use it. Alright, not only is this stuff going to be easier to shape if it's cold, but we also need a little bit of time to form our eyes and teeth, which we're going to do using an onion. And what we'll do once that's peeled is simply make 2 slices on the side like this, which should give us a couple somewhat eye-shaped pieces. And then since it's not really an eye unless it has a pupil, I'm going to go ahead and push in a couple cloves into the center. And that's it. So nothing too tricky. And then what we'll do for the teeth is slice off another section about 1 inch wide and cut those into a few tooth-like sections as shown. And then once those are done, we can move on to shape our zombie head, which I'm going to do on a sheet pan on which I placed down a piece of parchment paper. And if you'll notice, I sprinkled a little bit of water under that sheet so it doesn't slide around. And what we'll do using some damp hands is transfer our meat onto that sheet pan, and then to the best of our abilities, form some kind of skull-like shape. And while I'm no anatomy expert, I do know we need some kind of nasal cavity, as well as some freakishly large eye sockets, and of course some kind of mouth. And again, you'll want to keep your hands damp so the meat doesn't stick to your fingers. So we'll go ahead and orifice the meat. And let me spin mine around so you can see how I did. So that's looking pretty good, and by good I mean bad. And we are now ready to proceed to the most fun step, the baconing. And what we're attempting to do here is cover the surface with bacon, so they sort of look like the muscles on a face if the skin's been peeled off. And the only real tip I can give you here is try to get the ends of the bacon to end up either in an orifice or underneath the skull. And if you're wondering, did I Google a picture of the muscular structure of a face to help me with this? Yes, I did. And did that help? No, not really, but it didn't hurt. But anyway, we'll go ahead and cover our skull in bacon, as shown, in some sort of semi-symmetrical way. And then what we'll do once our surface has been covered and looking something like this is go ahead and press in our eyeballs. And we'll want to make sure we're pressing those in nice and deep. Okay, the last thing you're going to want with a zombie meatloaf is bulging eyeballs. So we will make sure those are well pushed in. And then, of course, we'll also go ahead and place in our teeth. And then once we decide we're happy with our dental work, we will move to the final phase of this face. And that'll be to place down a few more strategically placed strips of bacon that sort of overlap the edges of the eyes. And I really think it's these last few pieces that gives our zombie meatloaf that truly realistic look. Or I'm overthinking this. But anyway, I draped over a few more strips here and there. And obviously when you make yours, the exact placement will be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the undead of all that stuff I just said. So you go ahead and place those wherever you think they look good. And don't be afraid to use some torn or strangely shaped pieces, since I think that's going to add to the whole effect. And then at some point, no matter how fun this is, we're going to have to stop and do one last step before we can put this in the oven. And that's to take some kind of spatula and go around making sure all the bacon is well tucked underneath. And then once that's been accomplished, we are finally ready to bake this, which we'll do in the center of a 325-degree oven for about an hour, or until we reach an internal temp of 155. And about 10 or 15 minutes in, I got scared my onion eyes were going to brown, so I went ahead and covered those in foil and continued baking at 325 for, like I said, about an hour or so, until it looked like this. And yes, of course, we could have done this in a very hot oven and tried to get crispy bacon, but I was afraid it was all going to contract and not look as good. Plus, I think a meatloaf is much better and much moister, cooked at a lower heat. And I'm going to talk more about that on the blog. But I did want to acknowledge I sacrificed crispy bacon for a more realistic look. So I went ahead and uncovered the eyes, and then spooned out some of the juices from our nasal cavity and mouth. Although it may have been scarier to leave that in. And then as far as serving goes, what I did is transfer this to a cutting board and decide to go around the edge squirting some blood sauce, which I will give you the recipe to on the blog. It was just barbecue ketchup and hot sauce. So I went ahead and applied some of that to the outside edge, as well as into the mouth. And that's it. What I'm calling a zombie meatloaf is done and ready to terrify my guests. Although I have to admit, this is really not that scary in the middle of the day. But imagine this at night with candlelight. I imagine that's going to be pretty scary. But anyway, that concludes the gimmick stage of the video. And we can move on to was it a good meatloaf? Which it really was. So I sliced off a few pieces of chin and served that with a little bit of blood sauce over the top, next to some monster mashed potatoes, which are just like regular mashed potatoes, only with a different name. And even my buttered asparagus was scary, because it was grown by pagans. I'm sorry, not pagans, vegans, but still pretty scary. So I grabbed a fork and went in for a taste. And this really did turn out to be a moist and flavorful meatloaf. Okay, all those veggies, especially the mushrooms, really helped add a lot of moisture. And it's always been my experience that things roasted with like a pound of bacon wrapped around them usually come out tasting pretty good. And this certainly did. So even though you might not want to make this into a horrifying zombie face, I still think you're really going to enjoy this recipe. But having said that, I really do hope you take the extra few minutes to make this look frightening and grotesque. But either way, I really do hope you give it a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy pumpkin cinnamon rolls. That's right, I learned this from a witch who was turned into a zombie by a vampire werewolf, which is why I'm featuring it for Halloween. It's also scary delicious. And you know who loves this? Mummies. And speaking of Halloween, this video is just part of a larger playlist called Ultimate Halloween Treats on YouTube. So make sure you look out for that. But in the meantime, let me show you how to make this. So in the bowl of our electric stand mixer, I'm going to add 1 package of dry active yeast, a big pinch of sugar, and some very warm but not too hot water. About 100 degrees is good. I'm going to whisk that up, and we're going to let that yeast activate for about 10-15 minutes. And if your water wasn't too hot and the yeast was good, it's going to look like this. So after our yeast is all beautifully foamy like that, we're going to go ahead and start adding the rest of the ingredients in, which include pumpkin puree. That is not pumpkin pie filling, by the way. That is just pure pureed pumpkin. I'm also going to add some heavy cream, some salt, some melted butter, a splash of vanilla, and a little bit of pumpkin pie spice. And I'll explain what that is on the blog. And other than flour, that's pretty much it for the dough. Now at this point, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to put sugar in or not. I know there's some natural sweetness in the pumpkin, so I was just going to go ahead and add flour, but you'll see I changed my mind here in a minute. But anyway, at this point, we're going to add half our flour in and 1 whole egg. We're going to grab our dough hook attachment and start mixing this on a low speed. So we're just going to mix that for about 2 minutes until it looks like that. And at that point, I'm going to add in some sugar and the rest of the flour. So I basically changed my mind about the sugar. And when you do this, you can add that sugar right in with the pumpkin and the rest of the ingredients. Really doesn't matter as long as it's in there. And then we're going to turn that mixer back on low. And that's going to knead for about 6-7 minutes. And the amount of flour called for should just be barely enough to have that dough pull away from the sides of the bowl like that. So after a few minutes, if it's too wet and sticky, you can add a little more flour until it pulls away from the sides. And once it looks like that, like I said, you want to knead this for about 6 minutes. Until you have a very, very smooth, slightly sticky, and elastic dough. All right, it should be very, very soft and supple. See that? So mine's looking good and feeling amazing. At that point, we're going to want to drizzle in a couple drops of vegetable oil into the bowl, and we're going to use that to coat the dough. So I'm going to give it a little rub, a little oil massage, place it back in. I'm going to put some foil over the top, and we're going to let that dough double in size. It's going to take about an hour and a half, I guess. And while we're waiting, we might as well go ahead and make our sugar cinnamon filling, which is so easy. We're going to take some brown sugar, some white sugar, and a whole lot of cinnamon, and we're simply going to take a spoon and mix that together. So once that's mixed together, just set that aside, and we're ready for the dough, which hopefully by now is doubled in size. We're going to transfer that onto our cutting board that's been well floured. Of course, that's going to deflate the dough, which is fine, because what you're going to do is use your hands to pat it out into a kind of rectangular shape, right about 1 inch thick, something like that. Of course, you're flouring your hands when needed, and when it looks something like that, you're going to sprinkle it with a little bit of flour, switch to a rolling pin, and roll that out into a rectangle approximately 20 inches by 12 inches. So I'm going to check with my tape measure here. That's 20 by about 12, close enough for YouTube. And we are ready for maybe my favorite part, the buttering of the dough. And we're not talking about a little bit of butter. We're talking about a ton of butter. Can you use margarine for this? Absolutely not. If you do, I will have to haunt your dreams for eternity. So suit yourself. So I'm just using my pastry brush to cover the surface except the edge closest to you. I'm going to leave about 2 inches at the top there unbuttered because that's where we're going to finish our roll. So don't butter that front edge. At that point, I want you to evenly distribute your sugar mixture over the dough. All right, get it as even as possible. And once that's sprinkled on, you're going to take a little bit of water on your fingertip and just go right along that edge we left unbuttered. And you'll see why in a second. And at that point, you're ready to start rolling. So start at the bottom and roll up nice and tight. You don't want to smash everything, but you don't want any pockets of air in there. So roll it up nice and firmly. So you're going to roll it up, roll it up, roll it up. And when you get towards the end here, you're going to try to do 2 things. You're going to try to end up with the seam on the bottom. And you're also going to use your hands to kind of make it as even as possible. So that's looking good. And because we painted a little bit of water on that edge, that seam at the bottom is going to seal nicely. And that is ready to cut. So we're going to take off about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch on either end. Just because of the rolling, those ends are going to be mostly all dough. So trim a little bit off. Then I'm going to cut it in half. And then each half in half, which gives you 4 pieces. And if you cut each of those 4 pieces into 4, like I'm doing here, you're going to have 16 of these beautiful pinwheel pieces of dough. All right, you can see that beautiful cinnamon sugar filling in there. Just gorgeous. All right, those you're going to carefully place into a very well buttered baking dish. We're going to place those in. All right, make sure they're all evenly spaced. And now we need to let these double in size. So I'm going to wrap it in plastic. I'm going to put mine in the oven. The oven's off. I'm just using that as a place to let them rise. And mine took about 45 minutes, and they doubled, and they looked like that. So I'm going to take the plastic off. We're going to preheat our oven to 350 degrees. We're going to place those in the center of the oven. And we're going to bake those for exactly 30 minutes. And 30 minutes later, they're going to kind of look the same, but they're going to be baked. And the outside will have a little bit of a golden brown crust. So we're just going to leave those alone. We're going to let them sit right there for about 15 minutes to cool down a little bit while we make our cream cheese glaze, which is extremely easy. So check it out. So in a small bowl, I have some room temperature cream cheese, some powdered sugar, and a splash of milk. And I'm simply going to take a spoon and mix that until smooth. And yes, that spoon did turn into a whisk. So I don't know why I was using a spoon there, but a whisk is going to work much better. Now, some people like to put a few drops of vanilla here. I don't because I had vanilla in the dough. But you could double up if you're into the, vanilla thing. And when that is mixed and completely smooth, go ahead and spread it over your warm pumpkin cinnamon rolls. And of course you could just dump it on and spread it over, but if people are watching, slowly drizzle it. And while you do, look at the expression on their faces. Now that is casting a spell. And that is pretty much it. If you want to, you can garnish with a little bit of pumpkin seed. I think it looks nice. Those spots of green against that golden roll. I think that looks really good. And that was unbelievably delicious. Oh, and one pro tip, if you do serve these at a Halloween party, be careful of the zombies. After they finish the cinnamon rolls, sometimes they try to eat your brains. So just a heads up. And of course, the true test to any cinnamon roll, pumpkin or otherwise, is can you unravel it so that you can eat each sticky layer individually? Yes, you can. So anyway, like I said, this would make a great Halloween treat. Let the kids have the candy. We will enjoy some of these. So I really hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy pumpkin seed spread. That's right, each year the great pumpkin rises out of the pumpkin patch he thinks is most sincere, with presents for all the children of the world. Or at least that's what they told us. Turns out that wasn't true. So to help make up for that, I'm going to show you an incredibly delicious spread made from pumpkin seeds. And quite often at this point I'd tell you how easy it is. But with this, there's actually a little bit of prep involved. Although when you taste the final results, totally worth it. So let's go ahead and get started with the first thing we need to get ready. And that would be our garlic oil. So what we're going to do first is toss some garlic cloves in a cold dry pan. And I did about 7 or 8 cloves. The small ones I halved and the big ones I quartered. And then to that we're going to add some vegetable oil and set our heat to low. At which point we're going to try to accomplish 2 things. We're going to infuse this oil with the garlic flavor, while softening those pieces of garlic without browning them. Okay, so we want to adjust our heat somewhere near low so we get just little tiny bubbles coming out of those cloves. And then other than giving it a stir once in a while, all we'll do is cook this for about 8 to 10 minutes, or until those pieces of garlic just start to soften. And I'll be testing mine with my freakishly small wooden spoon. And what we'll do as soon as we feel those starting to get tender is simply turn off the heat and let them cool in the oil. So a pretty simple step, just try not to brown the garlic. And then once that's set, we'll move on to the second thing we need to prep, and that would be toasting our beautiful green pumpkin seeds, which by the way are raw shelled pumpkin seeds. Okay, if you try to make this dip with the ones with the shells on, it's not going to come out good. But anyway, what we'll do is add those to a cold dry pan, and we will toast these, stirring or tossing pretty much constantly, until our seeds are hot and fragrant. Okay, so we don't really want to toast these all the way golden brown. We want them to stay nice and green, but they should get very hot to the touch. And you should definitely get the fragrance of, toasted pumpkin seeds. So hopefully your nose knows when you've gone far enough. But if you have a cold and are stuffed up, you can always feel them and taste them. And once they do get to the point where they're smelling, looking, and feeling good, we'll simply turn off the heat and set those aside while we move on to the third thing we need to prep. And that would be our lightly charred onions and peppers. And for that, we'll get a little bit of vegetable oil nice and hot over high heat, to which we will add some diced onion, as well as some fairly finely diced serrano pepper, or jalapeno or any other hot pepper. And what we'll do is cook that over high heat until the edges start to brown and almost char. Hey, maybe a couple of smaller pieces even do char, but that's fine, because we do want those onions and peppers to take on a little bit of sweet smokiness. So we'll cook those stirring until they look something like this, at which point we're going to dump in some apple juice. It could be flat, it could be sparkling, it doesn't matter. But what we're going to do is pour that in, reduce our heat to medium, and cook it until that liquid reduces just about all the way. Okay, pretty much down to a syrup. So keep an eye on this. Don't go anywhere. If you go and try to do something for a minute, the chances of this burning are roughly 100%. So just stand there observing until our juice is pretty much reduced all the way, at which point we'll turn off the heat because we're done. And by the way, if you think you've gone too far, just sprinkle in a couple teaspoons of water. You'll be fine. That's just you cooking. And once that's set, we can move to the food processor to bring all these components together, plus other components. So let's go ahead and dump in our seeds, followed by one bunch of freshly picked cilantro leaves. Oh, and by the way, don't waste time trying to pick out all those little stems attached to the leaves. Those taste exactly the same, so no need. And then we'll go ahead and add our onion mixture, making sure we use a spatula to scrape in every drop of that goodness. And then the same goes for our softened garlic and oil. We'll go ahead and add that, making sure we get every precious drop. And then after that, to balance all this richness, we'll go ahead and add some freshly squeezed lime juice. And yes, I'm pretty sure lemon would also work, but I went with lime in keeping with the green theme. And then last but not least, we will finish this off with some salt, in a decent amount. And fair warning, we'll probably have to adjust with some more of that later. And at this point, we can pop on the lid and pulse this on and off, and process it until it becomes sort of a coarse paste. And as usual with this kind of thing, we will occasionally want to stop and scrape everything down with a spatula, so we don't have any rogue cilantro leaves or seeds that avoid being processed. You know, sort of like that one seed stuck to the side now that's mocking me. But anyway, we'll continue on until this comes together, like I said, into a coarse paste, at which point we're going to stop and take a look, which is probably definitely going to be too thick. So what we'll do is keep adding liquid and processing until it's exactly the texture we want. And I'm going to use more apple juice, but you could certainly just use water if you're happy with the flavor profile. But anyway, I tossed in some more juice and gave it a scrape down and continued processing, at which point I gave it another examination, and it was getting pretty close to what I wanted, which was sort of a hummus texture, which, by the way, would make for a pretty cool name for this. I ended up going with spread because hummus sounds a little more savory, and this is sort of in that gray area between sweet and savory. But anyway, the point is I checked it out and decided to need a little more juice. And as I mentioned, we'll just continue this process until we're totally happy with how it looks, which for me was something about like this. And of course, we can do some final adjustments before we serve, so just get it close. And what we'll do at this point is transfer it to a bowl, because what I suggest doing is covering this with plastic and refrigerating it until it's chilled before we serve. And this would probably be okay like this, but not only do I want to cool this down, I also want to give all those flavors time to meld together. Besides, if you're doing this for a party, you have other things to do. So I went ahead and covered that up and popped it in the fridge for a few hours, at which point we'll pull it out and give it a taste, and we'll do a final adjustment for seasoning and texture. So I decided mine needed a little more salt and a shake of cayenne. Plus, I also decided I wanted a little more acidity. But at the same time, I didn't want any more lime flavor. So I decided to go with apple cider vinegar, which accomplished exactly what I wanted, without throwing off the balance of the flavors. It also lightened up the texture just a touch. So I went ahead and stirred that in, and gave it one final taste, at which point I deemed it perfect, and transferred it into a serving dish. And then just because it's green, and the surface has kind of a coarse texture, I decided to take a teaspoon and give it some swishes. People seem to like swishes. And then I finished off monochromatically by sprinkling some pumpkin seeds over the top. And by the way, if you wanted something a little more colorful, some pomegranate seeds would probably work here. But of course, final garnishes are up to you. You are, after all, the lioness of your pumpkin seed spreads flyness. But regardless of what you use, once done, we'll put this next to some crackers. And that, my friends, at least I think, is an amazing seasonal spread. It's just a little bit sweet, and a whole lot of savory, and very, very addictive. Which is fine, because I think relative to most party spreads, this one is very nutritious and pretty good for you. And maybe it's just me, but for sort of a drab green, I find this absolutely gorgeous. But anyway, that's it. While unfortunately it's true there is no such thing as a great pumpkin, there is definitely such a thing as a great pumpkin seed spread. So whether you do this for a Halloween party, or just any time you want a delicious snack, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.